This week we enter our final module of the course. It's Module 5, Lecture 1, and we're looking at terms of use and social media policies. There's a slight departure this week from the textbook. We've pretty much finished looking at the various aspects of social media law, and we're looking more at the risk management side of it. So to that end, we have some set readings, academic readings, which you can access if you're logged on to the Griffith University Library, although some of them are freely available if you just Google them. Their addresses are there. The required reading this week are those by Tan, by the organisation ARMA, and by Klang and Nolan. There's no learning problem for this module because you've finished with your learning problems and you're preparing them to do your learning journal under the assessment criteria. What we're mainly preparing for now is your social media policy critique, your final assignment. And that's why we're talking about this week terms of use and social media policies, and next week looking at risk analysis. So we're covering terms of service and social media sites, the development of social media policies, analysis of social media policies, and we have a few discussion questions as usual. That's a reinforcing note that we are not having a learning problem for this module. Well, I've based each of the topic areas this week pretty much around your direct readings. So one quite challenging reading you've got to start with is Tan's article called Terms of Service on Social Media Sites. I say that it's challenging because it does get into some denser legal material. It is in the Media and Arts Law Review, which is published out of the University of Melbourne. And it does go into greater depth into the area of copyright on social media and how the terms of service appropriate people's work via their clauses related to copyright. For our purposes, it's a good example, but you're not expected to know all of this denser legal material on copyright intimately. But please just go with the flow and read the article bearing that in mind, because it certainly helps review and deepen your understanding of copyright law. And we've learned that earlier, and it explores the terms of service in that context. Well, we've all seen the terms of service on social media, sometimes called terms of use, sometimes called user agreements. They're the things we press I agree on when we sign up to a new social media platform. The thing is, most of us don't read them, and it would be very difficult for us to read them. So there's been some studies of this, and to actually sit down and read word for word one of the major platforms' terms of service could actually take several days. So what Tan says about that, and I have a couple of quotes here from Tan to sum this area up. She says, users have to tread through a labyrinth of terms and policies scattered over multiple documents, frequently accessible via hyperlinks, to ascertain their rights and obligations in relation to creative content on social media sites. And she also says there are critical contractual and copyright issues in different jurisdictions that have been buried from consideration by the terms of service of social media sites. Such terms of service unevenly reflects the interests of the prevalent media companies at the expense of their users. And I think those three quotes really sum up the thesis that Tan is proposing there, that while there is an attempt by the major social media platforms to appropriate your copyright in anything that you post there and to make it freely available to everyone else under the terms of service, certainly in the copyright area, this is buried and in so many different parts of their site with so many links, it could well be argued that it is too complex and too difficult for any reasonable person to actually read and understand, and even to access in some cases. So there are huge questions which need to be fought out in the legal territory as to how applicable these terms of service really are. Let's not forget, though, that terms of service aren't just about copyright. They cover the gamut of your interaction with a particular platform. They cover how that platform might handle your privacy, the extent to which they might cancel your account at some stage, the terms on which they might do that, their requirement that you actually give a proper identity and not a fake identity, and their actions they might take if you abuse their service or misuse it in some way. That's all very important as a background. Most important to your assignment, of course, is how social media policies are developed and critiqued. And that's where the ARMA article comes in very handy. It comes from the information management literature, and it's more of a popular magazine article, but it does give 21 key points from a US perspective on the development of social media policies. With a handy list of those and a handy chart, policy development workflow. I make a word of warning, though, that it's very important to note that an organisation shouldn't just have a social media policy independent of all other policies. Social media covers so much of workplace relations and workplace rules these days that it needs to be integrated into other policies. So whatever the other policies are, dismissal policies, policies related to discrimination, to do with occupational health and safety, all of these things can have a social media element to them, and social media needs to be considered in the review of these other policies. Well, let's look at ARMA's 21 points for the development of social media policies. We don't have 21 minutes, so we're not going to go through each of the points. But you can see the points, if we try to group them around various things, there are the establishment areas of the social media policy where you're setting up your purpose and objectives, the scope of the policy, some kind of mandate statement you're establishing, you're writing out the key definitions of terms that people need to understand, and establishing the roles and responsibilities and making reference, putting the references to the material that you've used. You need to control the version, make it clear what version you're working with, and offer a statement where it has been reviewed in some way and things have been changed. When you go into the policy itself, you need to establish the behavioural expectations of people in the organisation using it, state the privacy requirements, and this might be guided by the privacy legislation in your particular jurisdiction. Look at the elements of confidentiality that might apply to social media use. Guidance to the actual sites itself that are organised, that are associated with your organisation, listing what is permissible information to post to social media, and then there are various administrative tasks attached to that. Records management, keeping an effective record of the social media use and directions. The account maintenance, looking at what the accounts are for the organisation and how up to date they are so you don't get cyber squatted, as we looked at in a recent lecture. A legal statement, giving which clearly the lawyers would need some input into, which explains your rights and responsibilities as far as it goes. An intellectual property statement, that should sound bells for you now and stress the importance of that with social media. A security statement, an ownership statement, and very importantly, an enforcement statement, how the policy will be enforced, and a signature, where users are actually signing off that they have agreed to the policy. Now, this is an American model drawing mainly upon the American information management literature. There would be many different approaches, but I do think it covers the main bases. What it's missing though, and while it's not necessary to be in the policy itself, it's missing an explanation of how this is worked up and the extent to which stakeholders are identified and incorporated into the workings of the document. And that is to some extent how their policy development workflow works. Now, you can see from the policy development workflow slide that it's not very clear here in the PowerPoint slide situation. I've tried to cut it up so that it fits into a slide, and the writing is quite blurred. But it presents it in a flow chart style, and you'll need to go back into the article itself to get a clearer view. You might want to screen capture that from the electronic version of the article and keep that in your notes as you're looking at critiquing a social media policy, because there could be aspects of it that you think could have been improved in that workflow as you move into your critique. As far as the critique goes, the article by Klang and Nolan offers terrific guidance. Now, I know perhaps not many of you work in the local government sector. Some of you do, but most of you aren't from Sweden, and that's where the article is based. What the authors did here is they analysed social media policies in 26 Swedish municipalities. And what they, to my mind, what they've used are excellent analytical and theoretical tools which can be used in your own analysis of social media policies. What they found was that councils, local government bodies, demonstrated a so-called command and control approach to social media. And the authors argued that that doesn't necessarily work that well in a freewheeling, communicative, fairly participatory social media environment. To quote them, they said, enforcing a paper-based analog system onto what is arguably a digital speech-based world is bound to fail. Now, you might bear that in mind when you're looking at your own critique of social media policies to see the extent that they adopt a command and control approach. What their argument moots for is the application more of our stakeholder theory, more of an inclusive approach to social media development. Now, they do have some very useful graphics, which I've repeated here with a little bit more success than that flowchart. One graphic looks at the elements of regulation for social media use. And you'll notice law and policy factor in there along with affordances, user norms, and social norms. Now, the article explains in more detail the definitions of these terms, but I think, again, that could be a useful device for you to theorise in constructing your social media critique. The other very useful graphic they have are the 4 different foundational positions when writing social media policies. Because depending on the position you take, and depending on the way that you envisage, whether it's homogeneous or heterogeneous, whether it's a problem or it's a possibility, you can then divide the policies into more of a bureaucratic foundation, a branding style of foundation, a disciplining foundation, which is more that command and control or bureaucratic approach, and a participatory foundation. What this does for your purposes is gives you some language to contextualise and theorise about the policies. Finally, they put those regulators into a spectrum style of graphic with social media at the centre. And they use those same terms again that we've just been talking about, but within that spectrum you can see how the terms of use, the policy, the unwritten rules feed into whether it's regulated or unregulated, and limitations or affordance of the policy. Well, your discussion questions are centred around this. How well do your own organisation's social media activities fit within the major platforms' terms of service, with copyright, privacy, identity of users and so on? And how the social media policy development approach cited here was from America. So how would this differ in your country? Would there be different national, cultural mechanisms at play? And which aspects of Clang and Nolan's approach to social media policy analysis are of value to you in your own critique of other social media policies? Well, that's where we've been today. We've looked at terms of service and of the major platforms, and we've started to look at the development of social media policies and their analysis through these different articles in your readings. Where we're heading? Well, we develop that further next week when we start to look at risk analysis in social media with some new readings presented for your use. So please get into those readings, and meanwhile get onto the discussion board and start fleshing out those questions that we just looked at, because they are the ones that will be informing the quality of your final assignment on social media analysis. Bye for now.